You may have heard of Article 5 of NATO's Washington Treaty.
An attack against one would be an attack against all.
But what you may not realize is that the Treaty on European Union also has its own mutual assistance clause. This is Article 42.7. In November 2015, after the major terrorist attack at the Bataclan Theatre in Paris, France invoked Article 42.7 for the first and so far only time. But what does this article say, and what kind of obligations does it place on EU member states?
Article 42.7 states that if one EU member state becomes the victim of armed aggression on its territory, all the other EU member states have to provide assistance by all the means in their power. The affected member state should express what type of support it needs. All the other EU member states should then determine what kind of support they want to provide. For example, after the Bataclan attacks in 2015, some EU member states decided they wanted to support the military operations of France against Islamic State. Hence, Article 42.7 is completely member state driven and does not prescribe a role for the EU institutions.
Article 42.7 has long been dormant, but the tense geopolitical environment, the emergence of new threats, and the EU's increased ambition in the field of security and defense have led to a change. There is now a debate inside the EU about how the article works in practice, how armed aggression and territory should be interpreted, and to what extent the article applies to terrorism or to hybrid forms of aggression. Moreover, the article is sometimes misunderstood as the EU's equivalent of NATO's Article 5.
NATO and the EU are organizations of a very different nature. While NATO is a military alliance, the EU originally started as an economic project and has so far played a rather limited role in security and defense. As a result, for those EU member states that are also members of NATO, the alliance remains the cornerstone of their collective defense. Article 42.7 specifically acknowledges this in the writing of the article.
Nevertheless, the two treaty articles coexist and appear to be rather similar. What are the differences between them?
Firstly, Article 42.7 specifically highlights the special status of neutrality that some EU member states have, like Ireland and Austria. NATO's Article 5 does not include such exceptions. Secondly, both articles have a somewhat different interpretation of the term territory. Whereas the EU's Article 42.7 strictly refers to a member state's land territory, its territorial waters, and the airspace above them, the NATO's interpretation is somewhat broader, as described in Article 6 of the NATO Treaty.
Even though Article 42.7 should only be invoked as a last resort, in today's uncertain world, the article is far from just a hypothetical instrument. There are several types of aggression that could lead to the invocation of the article. Those could be a terrorist attack, a major cyber attack on national infrastructure, or even in case of a conventional military attack. If this happens, a lot would depend on whether or not the victim or even the attacker are members of NATO. That leaves us with 4 possible scenarios. Bob will break them down.
Scenario 1. An EU member state that is not a NATO ally could be attacked by a country outside NATO. This could, for example, happen if the Russian Federation would attack Finland or Sweden, 2 EU member states that are particularly concerned about their security at this very moment. Scenario 2. An EU member state that is also a NATO ally gets attacked by a non-NATO country, but chooses to invoke Article 42.7 and not NATO's Article 5. This could, for example, happen if Spain would face an attack on Ceuta and Melilla. These 2 exclaves in Africa fall within the scope of Article 42.7, but outside of the scope of the NATO treaty. Scenario 3. An EU member state that is not a member of NATO could become the victim of an armed attack by a NATO ally. This could, for example, happen if a clash would occur between Cyprus and Turkey, two countries with a long history of conflict. Scenario 4. In an even more complicated situation, an EU country that is also a member of NATO could invoke Article 42.7 against another NATO ally. This situation could occur if Greece would get into a conflict with Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean.
If a scenario unfolds in which an EU and NATO member state invokes Article 42.7 against another NATO ally, this will create a very difficult and perhaps even catastrophic situation. It would put the alliance under immense political and diplomatic pressure and could create an existential crisis for the institution. What can be done in such a situation?
If such a confrontation between two NATO allies were to happen, it would create serious problems. The alliance lacks the institutional mechanisms to resolve it, and it could even become paralyzed. Therefore, NATO and its allies will always try to avoid such situations from happening. For example, France recently engaged in a bilateral defense pact with Greece. This step was taken on the one hand to reassure Greece, but on the other hand to prevent Greece from having to invoke Article 42.7 against Turkey in the first place.
At present, EU member states are divided about the necessity, the scope, and the obligations that arise from Article 42.7. France actively promotes the article, but some EU member states want to ensure at all costs that it does not undermine NATO. Others prefer to stick to their position of neutrality or express doubts. Despite these differences of opinion, the article is here to stay. Why is that?
The article is particularly relevant for those EU member states that are not members of NATO, because they cannot rely on Article 5. But the article is also a reminder of the shared fate of the EU member states in an increasingly tense and uncertain world. As such, it supports the ambition of the European Union to become a more important actor in security and defense and to gain more strategic autonomy.
To learn more, read the Clingendael report, Uncharted and Uncomfortable, European Defense and the Mutual Assistance Clause of Article 42.7.